At 79 years old, Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the rain streak down the glass like the tears she'd learned to hide. Behind her, the voices of her own children echoed with a word that had become her prison. Impossible. But sometimes, the most impossible dreams are the ones worth dying for. Welcome back to our channel, where we believe that age is never a barrier to living your deepest truth. I'm so grateful you're here with us today. And if these stories of courage and transformation speak to your heart, consider subscribing, because together, we're proving that it's never too late to rewrite your story. This is Margaret's story, and it might just change how you see your own. Margaret Eleanor Thompson had spent 79 years living 37 miles from the ocean, yet she had never seen it. Not once, not ever. It wasn't geography that kept her landlocked. It was something far more complex, woven into the very fabric of her small-town existence like a thread she couldn't untangle. Born in 1944 in the heart of Kansas wheat country, Margaret had grown up in a world where dreams were luxuries and survival was an art form. Her father, a stern man with calloused hands and eyes that never seemed to look beyond the next harvest, had built their life around predictability. "The ocean's got nothing for people like us, Maggie," he'd say whenever she'd stare too long at the atlas in the one-room schoolhouse, her finger tracing the blue edges of distant shores. Nothing but salt water and broken promises. But Margaret had always felt something pulling at her, something that made her pause when she heard the word ocean on the radio, something that made her collect seashells from the gift shop whenever they made their rare trips to the county seat. Shells that had never touched real waves, never felt real tides, but somehow carried the whisper of something vast and calling. She'd hidden those shells in a mason jar beneath her bed, and at night, when the Kansas wind howled across the endless wheat, she'd hold them to her ear and imagine she could hear the ocean's voice. Her mother had found them once and thrown them away, saying they were fool's treasures that would only fill her head with notions too big for a farmer's daughter. Margaret had married young, as expected. Thomas Thompson was a good man, steady, reliable, with hands that knew how to coax life from stubborn soil, and a smile that had once made her believe that maybe love could be enough to quiet the restless something inside her chest. They'd built a life together, brick by careful brick. 3 children came, Sarah, Michael, and David, and with each birth, Margaret felt herself rooted deeper into the prairie earth. The mason jar of shells was replaced by diaper bags, then school supplies, then car payments and college funds. The ocean became a whisper, then a murmur, then something she only remembered in dreams. Thomas had been gone now for 8 years. Heart attack at 71, sudden as a summer storm. The funeral had been well attended, the casseroles had lasted for weeks, and the sympathy cards had eventually stopped coming. But in the quiet that followed, in the long evenings when the house felt too big and her reflection in the kitchen window looked like a stranger, Margaret began to hear something she hadn't heard in decades. The ocean, calling her name. It started small. A travel magazine left behind by the mailman, a nature documentary that made her pause with her hand on the remote. Then one evening, while organizing Thomas's things, she'd found an old road map tucked inside his favorite book. Someone had drawn a line in faded blue ink from their small Kansas town all the way to the Pacific coast. The line was labeled in Thomas's careful handwriting, "For Maggie's someday." She'd held that map against her chest and cried until her ribs ached. "Mom, you can't be serious." Sarah's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, sharp and dismissive. She stood in Margaret's kitchen, still wearing her hospital scrubs from the night shift, her face pinched with the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting other people's emergencies for 12 hours straight. Margaret kept her back turned, focusing on the coffee pot, trying to steady her trembling hands. She'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her mirror, but somehow Sarah's presence had reduced all her careful words to ash in her throat. I am serious, Margaret said quietly. I want to see the ocean. The ocean? Michael's voice joined the chorus from the dining room. He'd driven over when Sarah called him, abandoning his Saturday morning routine for what Sarah had dramatically termed a family emergency. At 48, Michael had inherited his grandfather's practical nature and his father's unwillingness to entertain what he called flights of fancy. Mom, you're 79 years old, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the patient but firm tone she used with difficult patience. You haven't traveled anywhere in 20 years. You get dizzy walking to the mailbox, and you want to drive across 4 states to look at water? David, the youngest at 43, sat silent in the corner. He'd always been the dreamer of the 3, the one who'd moved to Denver and sent postcards from mountain peaks and art galleries. But even he looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair like a man trying to find a diplomatic way to crush his mother's spirit. It's not just about looking at water, Margaret said, finally turning around. The map was spread across the kitchen table, Thomas's blue line pointing like an arrow toward her heart's destination. It's about something I should have done a long time ago. Should have done? Sarah's laugh was sharp, brittle. Mom, there's nothing you should have done. You raised 3 kids. You took care of Dad through 2 heart attacks. You've been the perfect wife and mother. Why this sudden need for adventure? The word adventure came out like an accusation, and Margaret felt something inside her wither. Perfect wife and mother. As if those roles had been a costume she'd worn so long she'd forgotten who lived underneath. Because, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, I promised someone I would. Promised who? Michael leaned forward, his businessman instincts detecting a story he could potentially debunk. Margaret's fingers traced the blue line on the map. Your father. Before we got married, I told him I wanted to see the ocean. He said someday we would. Someday when the farm was stable, when the kids were grown, when we had time. He kept that promise in his book for 54 years. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Margaret could see her children exchanging glances, the kind of looks that said, how do we handle this gently? Mom, David finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. Dad's been gone for 8 years. If this was so important, why didn't you do it then? Because I was afraid, Margaret thought. Because I'd forgotten who I was before I became yours. Because I thought the wanting would fade if I ignored it long enough. I wasn't ready then, she said instead. And you think you're ready now? Sarah stood up, her movement sharp with frustration. Mom, you're talking about a 1,000-mile drive. You could have a stroke, a heart attack, an accident. What if something happens to you out there, all alone? What if something happens to me here? Margaret's voice surprised herself with its strength. What if I die in this house, in this town, never having seen the thing I've dreamed about my whole life? What kind of life is that? A safe life, Michael said firmly. A reasonable life, an impossible life, Margaret whispered, more to herself than to them. But Sarah heard. Yes, she said, her voice cutting. It is impossible, Mom. This whole thing is impossible. You don't travel. You don't like change. You get anxious in new places. This isn't you. Margaret looked at her daughter, this strong, capable woman who'd inherited her father's certainty and her grandfather's fear of the unknown. She saw Michael nodding in agreement, saw David's uncomfortable silence. These were her children, the people who were supposed to know her best, and they were telling her who she was and who she wasn't, with the confidence of judges delivering a verdict. Maybe, Margaret said slowly, folding the map with careful hands. You don't know me as well as you think you do. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Margaret was already walking toward the stairs. The map clutched against her chest like armor. This conversation isn't over, Sarah called after her. Margaret paused at the bottom of the staircase. Yes, she said without turning around. It is. That night, Margaret sat in her bedroom surrounded by photo albums and memory boxes, searching for evidence of the woman she used to be. The house felt different after the confrontation, smaller somehow, as if the walls had absorbed her children's certainty and were pressing closer, trying to squeeze her back into the shape they expected. In a box labeled "Before Kids," she found herself at 22, laughing in a sundress at the county fair. There was something in that young woman's eyes, a brightness, a readiness, as if she was standing at the edge of a diving board, eager to jump. When had that brightness faded? When had she stopped looking toward horizons and started looking only at what was directly in front of her feet? The map lay spread across her bedspread, Thomas's blue line seeming to glow in the lamplight. She traced it with her finger, wondering if he'd drawn it the day after their wedding, or years later when her dreams had already begun to fade. Had he been planning their someday all along? Had he carried her ocean wish in his heart, the way she'd carried those childhood shells? The next few weeks fell into a careful dance of avoidance. Sarah called every day, her voice bright and determinedly normal, as if the kitchen conversation had never happened. Michael dropped by with groceries and small repairs, whistling while he worked, his cheerfulness aggressive in its normalcy. David sent postcards from his business trips, each one showing landlocked scenes, mountains, deserts, prairies, as if he was trying to remind her that beauty existed in places that didn't require impossible journeys. But Margaret had made a discovery. Once a dream is spoken aloud, it becomes harder to pretend it doesn't exist. She found herself researching coastal towns on the library's ancient computer, printing out pictures of lighthouses and boardwalks when the librarian wasn't looking. She bought a road atlas and studied the routes, calculating drive times and gas stops with the meticulous attention she'd once devoted to planning birthday parties and holiday meals. The ocean called to her in grocery store aisles when she caught glimpses of seafood displays. It whispered in weather reports that mentioned coastal storms. It hummed in her dreams, where she walked on endless beaches under skies so wide they made her dizzy with possibility. 3 weeks after the kitchen confrontation, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She walked into First National Bank and withdrew $5,000 from her savings account, money she'd been keeping for emergencies. Standing in the parking lot with the envelope of cash in her purse, she realized that maybe this was what an emergency looked like for someone like her. Not a medical crisis or a home repair disaster, but the emergency of a life running out of time to be lived. That evening, she called the number on a travel brochure she'd picked up at the bank. The voice that answered was young and enthusiastic, belonging to someone named Jessica, who talked about coastal packages and senior-friendly accommodations, as if helping 79-year-old women chase impossible dreams was the most natural thing in the world. "I want to see the Pacific Ocean," Margaret told her, and the words felt like a prayer she'd finally found the courage to speak. "Oh, how wonderful!" Jessica's voice sparkled through the phone. "First time?" "First time," Margaret confirmed, and felt something inside her chest begin to unfold like wings she'd forgotten she had. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, addressed in Margaret's careful handwriting to herself, a trick she'd learned from watching her neighbor, who ordered packages online and had them held for pickup to avoid her nosy family. Inside was a confirmation for a 5-day coastal tour, round-trip transportation included, departure dates circled in red ink like a promise she'd made with her own blood. For 3 days, Margaret carried the envelope with her everywhere. To the grocery store, to her doctor's appointment, to church on Sunday where she sat in the back pew and wondered if dreaming at 79 was a sin or a sacrament. The paper grew soft from handling, and she began to know its contents by heart. Pacific Coastal Adventure Tour. Departure, March 15th. Return, March 19th. All meals included. Professional guide. Small group experience. Small group experience. That phrase both comforted and terrified her. Would there be other people like her, chasing late-life dreams? Or would she be the only fool who'd waited until her hair was silver and her hands shook to remember what she wanted? The decision to tell her children came not from courage but from exhaustion. Margaret was tired of carrying secrets, tired of the weight of unspoken dreams, tired of living like a woman with nothing to look forward to but doctor's appointments and grocery shopping, and the slow, predictable countdown of ordinary days. She called them over for Sunday dinner, prepared Thomas's favorite pot roast, and set the table with her wedding china. If this was going to be a battle, she reasoned, she might as well fight it with dignity. "I need to tell you something," she said as they finished dessert. The envelope sat beside her plate like evidence waiting to be presented to a jury. Sarah immediately tensed. "What is it, Mom?" Margaret slid the envelope across the table. "I booked a trip to see the ocean. I leave next week." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael was the first to break it, his voice carefully controlled. "You did what?" "I booked a tour. It's perfectly safe. Group travel, professional guide, nice hotels." Margaret's voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I wanted you to know because I'll be gone for 5 days." Sarah had opened the envelope and was reading the confirmation with the kind of clinical attention she usually reserved for medical charts. "Mom, this is a lot of money, and you didn't discuss it with anyone." "I discussed it with the travel agent," Margaret said mildly. "Her name is Jessica, and she was very helpful." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Sarah's voice was rising. "You can't just decide to take off across the country without talking to your family. What if something happens? What if you get sick? What if you get lost? What if I don't go, and I spend the rest of my life wondering what I missed?" David leaned back in his chair, studying his mother with new eyes. "Mom, where is this coming from? This isn't like you." "Maybe it is like me," Margaret said. "Maybe it's exactly like me and I just forgot for a while." Michael had been doing calculations on his phone. "Mom, this tour company, did you research them? Check their safety record? Read reviews?" "I read enough," Margaret lied smoothly. In truth, Jessica's enthusiasm and the 4-star rating on the website had been enough to convince her. Sometimes, she was learning, faith had to be enough when facts felt too heavy to carry. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, her professional demeanor cracking to reveal something raw and frightened underneath. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. This is exactly the kind of impulsive decision that people your age shouldn't make alone. People your age." The phrase hit Margaret like a physical blow, and she saw herself suddenly through her daughter's eyes. Fragile, confused, teetering on the edge of senility. A problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. "I am thinking clearly," Margaret said, her voice quiet but steel strong. "For the first time in years, I am thinking completely clearly." "No, you're not." Sarah stood up, pacing to the window as if she could find rational arguments in the backyard. "You're thinking like someone who's having some kind of crisis. This whole ocean obsession, it's not normal, Mom. It's not healthy. Neither is living in a box." Margaret shot back, surprising herself with the sharpness of her words. "Neither is being afraid of everything beyond these walls." "We're not afraid," Michael said defensively. "We're realistic. We're trying to protect you." "From what? From living?" Margaret stood up too, suddenly needing the advantage of height even though all 3 of her children towered over her. "From experiencing something beautiful? From having one adventure before I die? From disappointment?" The words erupted from Sarah like a dam breaking. "From spending all your money on some fantasy that won't live up to what you've built up in your head. From getting hurt, from being alone, from leaving us to pick up the pieces when it all goes wrong." And there it was, the truth underneath all their reasonable concerns. They weren't afraid of Margaret getting hurt on her trip. They were afraid of having to deal with the aftermath of her disappointment, of her potential regret, of her being fully human instead of simply and safely Mom. "So I should stay here," Margaret said slowly, "and be disappointed for the rest of my life instead?" "That's not what we're saying." David spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice gentle but firm. "We're saying maybe there are other ways to to satisfy this feeling. Maybe we could plan a nice trip together, somewhere closer. Maybe we could get you some nature documentaries, or maybe you could trust that I know what I need." Margaret's voice cut through his suggestions like a blade through silk. "Maybe you could believe that I raised 3 children and managed a household and took care of your father through 2 heart attacks, so I might be capable of taking care of myself for 5 days." "This is different," Sarah insisted. "This is impossible," Margaret finished. "Yes, I remember you mentioning that." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with all the weight they'd given it, all the power they'd allowed it to have. Margaret looked at her 3 children, these adults she'd raised to be careful, responsible, reasonable, and saw that somewhere along the way, she'd also raised them to be afraid. "I am going," she said simply. "You can support me, or you can fight me, but you cannot stop me." Sarah's face had gone pale. "Mom, if you do this, if you go through with this foolishness, I won't be able to help you when it goes wrong. I won't be able to fix it." Margaret walked around the table and cupped her daughter's face in her hands, feeling the familiar weight of trying to comfort her children, even when they were breaking her heart. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm just asking you to let me live." The morning of March 15th dawned gray and windy. With clouds that hung low over the Kansas plains like a ceiling, Margaret was finally ready to break through. She stood at her bedroom window, watching her neighbors begin their ordinary Tuesday routines, and felt like an astronaut preparing for launch. Her suitcase sat by the front door, small, practical, containing 5 days' worth of clothes she'd chosen carefully for their comfort and their ability to make her feel like the woman she was becoming rather than the woman she'd always been. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, she'd packed the road map with Thomas's blue line. Some journeys, she'd realized, required witnesses. The tour bus was scheduled to pick her up at 8 a.m. from the community center parking lot. She'd driven by 3 times in the past week, timing the route, making sure she knew exactly where to wait. The parking lot had looked enormous and empty each time, making her wonder if she'd be the only passenger, the only person foolish enough to chase dreams at an age when most people were settling into the comfortable routine of giving up. Sarah hadn't spoken to her since Sunday dinner. Michael had called twice, offering one last chance to think about this rationally, his voice careful and controlled in a way that made Margaret's heart ache for the little boy, who used to ask her to read him the same story every night for months on end. David had sent flowers, white roses with a card that said simply, "Be safe, Mom. Be happy." They sat on her kitchen table like a blessing and a goodbye. At 7:30, Margaret loaded her suitcase into her car and drove through the sleeping town toward her departure point. The streets looked different in the early morning light, smaller somehow, like a movie set she was finally walking away from after playing the same role for too long. She passed the high school where she'd graduated valedictorian with dreams bigger than the prairie sky, the church where she'd married Thomas with promises that felt infinite, the grocery store where she'd spent decades buying food to feed everyone, but the hunger in her own soul. The community center parking lot wasn't empty. A small cluster of people stood near the curb, suitcases at their feet, faces bright with the particular mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes with voluntary adventure. Margaret parked her car and sat for a moment, watching them. There was a woman about her age wearing a red coat and sensible shoes. Another woman, perhaps a decade younger, with silver-streaked hair and a camera bag. A couple that looked to be in their 60s, holding hands and consulting a guidebook. People like her. Dreamers who'd waited until their hair was silver to remember what they wanted. Margaret got out of her car and walked toward the group, her suitcase wheels clicking against the asphalt like a countdown to something magnificent. The woman in the red coat turned and smiled, the kind of smile that said, "I see you, fellow adventurer. Welcome to the club of people brave enough to want something." "First time seeing the ocean?" the woman asked, and Margaret nodded, suddenly unable to speak around the emotion lodged in her throat. "Me too," the woman said. I'm Eleanor. I've been dreaming about this since I was 12 years old and saw a picture of the Pacific in National Geographic. What took you so long? Margaret thought about all the years, all the reasons, all the careful responsibilities that had kept her landlocked. Life, she said simply. Eleanor nodded as if this was the most sensible answer in the world. Well, she said, we're here now. The tour bus rounded the corner at exactly 8 a.m. A comfortable-looking coach with tinted windows and Pacific Coastal Tours, painted along the side in cheerful blue letters. The driver who climbed out was a woman in her 50s with graying brown hair and laugh lines around her eyes. Someone who looked like she'd spent her life helping people find their way to beautiful places. "Good morning, dreamers," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the parking lot. "I'm Linda, and I'll be your guide on this journey to the edge of everything. Who's ready to see some water?" A cheer went up from the small group, and Margaret found herself laughing. Actually laughing, for the first time in weeks. She climbed aboard the bus and chose a seat by the window, her heart beating fast with something that felt dangerously close to joy. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Margaret looked back once at her town, her ordinary life, her carefully constructed safety. Then she turned toward the front of the bus, toward the west, toward the place where the land ended and the dreams began. Behind her, Kansas stretched endlessly in all directions. Ahead of her, somewhere beyond the horizon, the Pacific Ocean waited with infinite patience for a 79-year-old woman who'd finally found the courage to believe in impossible things. The bus rolled west through a landscape that changed like pages in a book Margaret had never read. Kansas gave way to Colorado, where mountains rose from the plains like the vertebrae of sleeping giants. Margaret pressed her face to the window and watched the world grow vertical, marveling at how quickly familiar could become foreign, how many kinds of beauty existed beyond the borders of her small-town knowledge. Eleanor sat beside her, sharing stories that felt like gifts. She'd been a teacher for 42 years, had raised 4 children as a single mother after her husband died young, had spent decades putting everyone else's dreams ahead of her own. "But my youngest graduated college last year," she said, unwrapping a sandwich she'd packed, "and I realized I was finally free to disappoint people in service of making myself happy." The phrase stuck in Margaret's mind. Disappoint people in service of making yourself happy. When had disappointing others become the worst possible sin? When had she learned to measure her worth by how successfully she managed to meet everyone else's expectations while quietly suffocating her own hopes? Linda, their guide, had a gift for making the journey feel like an unfolding revelation. She pointed out geological formations and told stories about the settlers who'd crossed these same plains, heading west with nothing but faith and desperation driving them toward uncertain futures. "Dreams," Linda said over the bus's intercom as they climbed into the Rockies, "are just another kind of frontier, and frontiers have always belonged to the brave." Margaret thought about Thomas, wondering if he'd felt this same mixture of terror and exhilaration when he'd drawn that blue line on the map. Had he imagined her sitting on this bus, watching America unfold outside her window like a promise finally being kept? Had he known, even then, that someday she would need to make this journey not just for the dream, but for the woman she'd been before she learned to make herself smaller? By evening they'd reached Colorado Springs, where they stopped for the night at a hotel with a view of Pikes Peak. Margaret stood on her balcony in the mountain air, breathing deeply and marveling at how different the sky looked when it wasn't pressed flat by prairie winds. The stars seemed closer here, more numerous, as if altitude had somehow brought her nearer to heaven. Her phone had been buzzing all day with messages from her children. Sarah's texts grew increasingly frantic. "Mom, please call. I'm worried. This is crazy. Come home. I can't sleep knowing you're out there alone." Michael's messages were more restrained but equally concerned. "Hope you're safe. Call when you can." David had sent a single text. "Proud of you, Mom." Margaret sat on her hotel bed and composed a group text. something she'd never done before. I am safe. I am happy. I am exactly where I need to be. Love you all. Then she turned off her phone and went to sleep with the sound of mountain wind instead of prairie wind singing outside her window. The next morning brought Utah, where red rock formations reached toward cobalt skies like prayers carved in stone. The landscape was so alien, so magnificent, that Margaret found herself weeping without knowing why. Eleanor handed her tissues without comment, understanding that sometimes beauty hits so hard, it has to escape through tears. I never knew, Margaret whispered, watching sandstone cliffs scroll past like a geological symphony. I never knew the world was so big, Eleanor suggested. Possible, Margaret finished. That afternoon, they stopped at a roadside diner in Nevada, where the waitress wore turquoise jewelry and called everyone honey in a voice that suggested she'd seen every kind of human story pass through her restaurant. Margaret ordered fish tacos, something she'd never eaten, something that tasted like adventure and salt, and the promise of waters she hadn't yet seen. You nervous about tomorrow? Eleanor asked as they waited for their food. Tomorrow. Tomorrow they would reach the coast. Tomorrow, Margaret would stand at the edge of the continent and look out at the thing she'd dreamed about for 79 years. Terrified, Margaret admitted. What if it's not what I hoped? What if I've built it up too much in my mind? What if I get there and feel nothing? Eleanor considered this seriously. Then you'll feel nothing, she said finally. And that will be okay too, because you'll know. And knowing is better than wondering for the rest of your life. That evening, they stopped in Nevada, still hours from the coast, but close enough that Margaret swore she could smell something different in the air. A hint of salt, a whisper of vastness. She called her children from her hotel room, needing to hear their voices, needing to share this journey even if they couldn't understand it. Mom? Sarah's voice was tight with worry and something that might have been relief. Are you okay? We've been so scared. I'm more than okay, Margaret said, and realized it was true. I'm discovering things about myself I forgot I knew. Like what? This from Michael, who'd obviously been added to the call. Margaret looked out her hotel window at the Nevada sky, vast and star-drunk and nothing like the tame skies of home. Like I'm braver than I thought, she said. Like I'm stronger than you taught me to believe I was. There was a silence on the other end of the line, and Margaret could almost hear her children recalibrating their image of her, trying to fit this new version of their mother into the frame of the woman they thought they knew. Are you coming back? David's voice was small, uncertain. Margaret's heart broke a little at the question. Oh, sweetheart, of course I'm coming back. But I might be coming back different. Different how? Sarah asked. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to find words for the transformation she felt happening inside her chest. The way her soul seemed to be expanding with each mile traveled, each boundary crossed. Different like I remember who I used to be. Different like I know who I still am. After they said goodbye, Margaret sat in the gathering darkness and thought about tomorrow. In 12 hours, she would see the Pacific Ocean for the first time. In 12 hours, she would stand at the place where her dreams met reality. In 12 hours, she would finally understand what Thomas had tried to give her with that blue line on the map. Not just a destination, but permission to want something magnificent. She fell asleep that night with the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears, counting down to the moment when impossible would finally become possible. Margaret woke at dawn without an alarm, her body electric with anticipation. Through her hotel window, the California morning was soft and golden, different from any light she'd ever seen, warmer somehow, more forgiving, as if the sun here had learned to be gentler in deference to all the dreams it illuminated. Linda gathered the group after breakfast, her eyes bright with the particular joy of someone about to deliver a long-awaited gift. Today's the day, dreamers, she announced. We're 2 hours from the coast, 2 hours from the edge of everything. The bus was quieter this morning, filled with the reverent hush of people approaching something sacred. Margaret sat by her window and watched California unfold, rolling hills covered in golden grass, valleys dotted with orange groves, mountains that seemed to march toward some unseen destination. Everything felt charged with possibility, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. Eleanor reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. "How are you feeling?" Margaret considered the question seriously. How was she feeling? Like a woman who'd been holding her breath for 79 years and was finally about to exhale. Like someone who'd been living in black and white was about to see color. Like a person who'd been pretending to be satisfied with crumbs was about to feast. "Ready," she said simply, and knew it was true. The first sign that they were approaching the coast came not from sight, but from scent. A freshness in the air that spoke of vastness and salt, and something wild that had never been tamed. Margaret opened her bus window slightly and breathed deeply, feeling something in her chest unfurl like wings she'd forgotten she had. Then Linda's voice came over the intercom, warm with understanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you look to your left in about 30 seconds, you're going to see something special." Margaret pressed her face to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The road curved around a hill covered in scrub brush and wildflowers, and then, there it was. The Pacific Ocean stretched from horizon to horizon, an endless expanse of blue that seemed to swallow the sky. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, and she felt tears start before she could stop them. It was bigger than she'd imagined, more beautiful, more alive. The water moved with a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat, waves rolling endlessly toward shore in patterns that spoke of tides and moons and forces larger than human understanding. "Oh," she whispered, her hand pressed against the glass. "Oh my." The bus wound down toward the coastline, and with each curve in the road, the ocean revealed more of itself. Margaret saw rocky outcroppings where waves crashed in explosions of white foam, stretches of golden sand that seemed to go on forever, seabirds wheeling and crying in voices that sounded like laughter and longing combined. When they finally pulled into the parking lot of the Mendocino Headland State Park, Margaret sat frozen in her seat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. She was here. After 79 years of dreaming, wondering, imagining, she was finally here. Linda stood at the front of the bus, her voice gentle with understanding. "Take your time, everyone. The ocean's been waiting for you your whole lives. It's not going anywhere in the next few minutes." Margaret forced herself to stand on legs that felt suddenly uncertain. She followed the group off the bus and onto a wooden pathway that led through tall grass toward the sound of waves. Each step brought the roar of the ocean closer, louder, until it filled her ears and her chest, and seemed to vibrate in her bones. And then she reached the edge. Margaret stood on the bluff and looked out at infinity. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before her, so vast it made her dizzy, so beautiful it made her ache. The water was every shade of blue she'd ever imagined, and colors she'd never dreamed possible. Deep navy in the distance, turquoise near the shore, silver where the sun touched the waves. She gripped the wooden railing with both hands and let herself really look, really see, really experience the thing she'd carried in her heart like a secret flame for 79 years. The salt air filled her lungs. The sound of waves filled her ears, and something inside her that had been clenched tight for decades finally relaxed. This was what Thomas had wanted for her. This moment, this feeling, this expansion of everything she thought she knew about beauty and possibility. The blue line on his map hadn't just been directions to a destination. It had been directions to herself. Margaret pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called the only number that mattered in that moment. "Sarah," she said when her daughter answered, her voice thick with tears and wonder. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" "Nothing's wrong," Margaret whispered, unable to look away from the endless water. "Everything's right. I'm looking at the ocean, sweetheart. I'm finally looking at the ocean. There was silence on the other end of the line, and Margaret could picture her daughter's face, the careful concern, the reluctant understanding, the slow recognition that maybe, just maybe, her mother had known what she needed all along. "What does it look like?" Sarah asked finally, her voice softer than it had been in weeks. Margaret tried to find words for the impossible beauty spread before her, for the way the water seemed to breathe, for the way the horizon curved like a promise of worlds beyond imagining. "Like coming home to a place I've never been," she said finally. "Like every dream I ever had was too small." She stayed on the bluff until the sun began to set, painting the ocean in shades of gold and pink and orange that seemed too beautiful to be real. Other tourists came and went, but Margaret remained, feeling like a woman who'd been thirsty her whole life, finally finding water. Eleanor found her there as darkness began to fall. "How was it?" she asked. "Meeting your dream face to face?" Margaret turned away from the ocean for the first time in hours, her face streaked with tears she hadn't realized she was still crying. "It was everything," she said simply. "And more than everything, it was impossible made possible." The journey home felt different, not like retreat, but like integration. Margaret sat in the same seat by the same window, but she was not the same woman who'd boarded this bus 5 days earlier. She carried the ocean inside her now, could close her eyes and hear the waves, could breathe deeply and taste salt air, even as they drove through Nevada desert. Linda had given each passenger a small vial of sand and a smooth piece of sea glass as mementos. Margaret held hers carefully, marveling at how something so small could contain so much. The sand was golden white and fine as powder, nothing like the heavy earth of Kansas. The sea glass was pale green, worn smooth by countless tides, transformed by the ocean from something sharp into something beautiful. "Proof," Eleanor said, holding up her own vial. "Proof that we were brave enough to want something magnificent." They crossed back through California and Nevada and Colorado, retracing their path but seeing everything differently now. The mountains looked like stepping stones rather than barriers. The desert seemed full of hidden life rather than emptiness. Even the Kansas plains, when they finally appeared, looked less like limitations and more like foundations. Margaret's phone had been quiet for most of the trip home. Her children, she realized, were giving her space to process, to integrate, to become whoever she was becoming. But as they pulled into the community center parking lot where she'd started this journey, she saw 3 familiar cars waiting. Sarah, Michael, and David stood by the curb, their faces uncertain but hopeful, like people waiting to meet someone they'd heard about but never actually encountered. Margaret gathered her small suitcase and her vials of proof and walked toward them on legs that still remembered the feeling of standing at the edge of everything. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was tentative, searching. Margaret looked at her children, these adults she'd raised to be careful, responsible, reasonable, and saw them clearly for the first time in years. They weren't trying to hold her back out of cruelty or control. They were trying to protect someone they loved from disappointment, from failure, from the particular pain that comes when reality doesn't match dreams. But they had never considered that reality might exceed dreams. They had never imagined that their careful, practical mother might be strong enough to handle beauty so vast. It defied description. "I saw it," Margaret said simply, and her voice carried something that made all 3 of her children step closer. "I saw the ocean." "And?" Michael asked, the question careful but genuine. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed them a picture she'd taken from the bluff, the Pacific stretching endlessly under a sky painted with sunset colors. It was a beautiful photograph, but she knew it captured maybe 1% of the actual experience, maybe 1,000th of the way it had felt to stand there and finally understand what her heart had been reaching toward her entire life. "And it was impossible," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Just like you said, it was completely, utterly impossible. and it was the most possible thing I've ever done. Sarah stepped forward first, her arms opening tentatively. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry we tried to stop you. Margaret held her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her body. You didn't know, she said gently. None of us knew what I was capable of. And what were you capable of? David asked. Margaret looked at her youngest son, the dreamer who'd moved to Denver but had somehow learned to be afraid of his mother's dreams. More than we thought, she said. So much more than we thought. 6 months later, Margaret's kitchen table held a new map. This one marked with Eleanor's careful handwriting, plotting a route to the Atlantic coast. They'd kept in touch after their Pacific adventure. Two women who'd discovered that friendship formed in the crucible of fulfilled dreams was unlike any other kind of bond. Maine, Eleanor said over the phone, her voice bright with anticipation. I want to see where the sun rises over the water. Count me in, Margaret said without hesitation, and marveled at how easy it had become to say yes to impossible things. Her children had stopped calling her adventures impossible. Sarah had even asked to see all the photos from the Pacific trip, listening with fascination as Margaret described the feeling of salt air and the sound of waves and the way the horizon curved like a promise. Michael had researched the tour company and grudgingly admitted they had excellent safety ratings and glowing reviews. David had sent her a book of coastal photography with an inscription that made her cry. To Mom, who taught me that dreams don't have expiration dates. The ocean had changed more than just Margaret. It had changed her children's understanding of who she was, what she was capable of, what she deserved from the life she had left to live. They began calling more often, not to check on her safety, but to hear about her plans, her discoveries, her gradual expansion into the woman she'd always been, underneath the careful roles of wife and mother. Thomas's map still sat framed on Margaret's dresser, but now it was joined by new maps, new possibilities, new blue lines drawn in her own confident handwriting. The Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, the coast of Maine. Each destination was a promise she was making to herself, a commitment to the woman who'd spent 79 years forgetting she was allowed to want magnificent things. Late at night, when the Kansas wind sang across the plains and the house settled around her like a familiar embrace, Margaret would hold her vial of Pacific sand and her piece of sea glass, and remember the feeling of standing at the edge of everything. She would close her eyes and hear the waves, taste the salt air, feel the expansion in her chest that came from finally understanding that impossible was just another word for not yet attempted. The ocean was still there, still calling, still welcoming dreamers brave enough to make the journey. And Margaret Eleanor Thompson, 79 years old and finally fully alive, was already planning her return. Some dreams, she'd learned, were worth a lifetime of waiting. But the best dreams, the ones that changed everything, were the ones you finally stopped waiting for and started living instead. At 79, her family had said it was impossible. They'd been wrong about that. They'd been wrong about everything. Thank you for joining us on Margaret's journey today. If her story touched your heart, remember that it's never too late to listen to the dreams that call your name. Age is not a barrier to living fully. It's simply another starting point for a new adventure. What ocean is calling your name? What impossible dream are you ready to make possible? Until next time, keep dreaming, keep believing, and keep proving that the best chapters of our lives might still be waiting to be written.